Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Accent. I'm Carrie, your host, and today we're looking into the importance of teaching intonation. Yes, the musical quality in our speech that does so much more than just add, some superficial flavors to our sentences. We're going to explore how intonation shapes our discourse, how it can be taught and how it should be taught, and what that means for both teachers and learners. Let us dive in. So, back in the 1970s, as linguists began analyzing natural conversation, intonation moved from the sidelines, thankfully, into the spotlight. Researchers like Labov, Gumpertz, and Himes showed us that intonation isn't just a decoration. It regulates, right? It regulates interaction. It makes meaning. It makes it happen. And so we're looking at 4 major functions, at least, and I want to break them down first. We're going to start with grammatical function. Think of how a rising tone at the end of a sentence can turn a statement into a question. You said what? So you're not coming? It's not just typical yes or no questions. You can take any phrase that has a subject and a verb in it and turn it into a question just by being playful with your intonational patterns. For instance, check this one out.
You have to be pretty generous to give 1.3 million to someone that you hardly know.
Objection? Is that a question?
Let me rephrase. You have to be pretty generous to give 1.3 million to someone that you hardly know.
So it's that little tiny pitch shift that signals structure and it clarifies meaning. So it's about organizing and clarifying. And this is where it's super practical and pretty essential. So it cannot be ignored in classroom. It just can't. You're a teacher of English, get to it, right into it, right now. Number 2, attitudinal function. Beyond the grammar, beyond the essential structuring, intonation carries our feelings. And boy, do I love to talk about that. Whether we're expressing surprise, skepticism, or excitement, our tone works with loudness, stress, and even our body language and our, how our face works, how the muscles are going to move around. All of that is going to be reflected, and the way you say things is going to be reflected in your body big time. All those attitudes are communicated via several levels, and you want the intonational one to be taken care of.
I have to go. We have to leave now. I have to leave. We have to leave now. I have to go.
Now, discourse function, one that I really, really want to draw your attention to today's in everyday conversation. Pitch and pause help us structure our speech. That is, they signal when one thought ends and another begins, and it guides the listeners through the narrative. Much like chapters in a book, much like punctuation, right? And it might seem, pretty obvious, once you hear someone say it, okay, so it helps you structure the phrase, but it's structured a very certain way, and it will be different for many other languages. So it's so important to know the ropes, to know how to work it, to know how to make this happen and not make that happen by accident. So it's up to us to stay listener friendly when talking to people. Well, that is native speakers as well. We got to take care of them.
My best friend and my sister. I cannot believe this.
Look, we're not just messing around. I love her. Okay? I'm in love with her.
My best friend and my sister.
Moving on to the indexical function, and this is where we can think of it as an identity function as well. There's the social side of things. I bet you've noticed people talk a lot about the Valley Girl inflection, where it rises at the end of a sentence, even though it's a statement.
But I did have some meetings at Beverly Hills Hotel, and that was strange.
Did you notice I just turned into like a valley girl? I was at the Beverly Hills Hotel.
And there's very many regional variations in speech that are going to have those little quirks to them. So that is intonation, that is marking who we are and where we come from. And that we will communicate always to an extent, some on purpose, some by accident. Now, there is two major models, one from David Brazil and the other by Janet Pierre-Humbert. Now, they approach intonation from very different angles. Brazil's model is all about capturing natural everyday speech, so I'm very much pro-Brazil because it's very hands-on, whereas Pierre-Humbert's approach digs into the underlying phonological structures. I'll tell you more in a bit. Even with their differences, both approaches agree that intonation plays a key role in managing information and social interaction and conversation. It is crucial, crucial, crucial. Today, our focus is mainly on David Brazil's discourse intonational model. Imagine listening to a conversation where every rise and fall in pitch isn't just random. So it's a deliberate, meaningful choice that structures the talk, right? The structural function is being realized through it. That is the heart of Brazil's work. His model breaks speech down into natural, meaningful chunks, and they are called tone units. In each tone unit, the speaker decides where to place emphasis, highlighting a particular syllable, and then selects the pitch levels at the start and end to signal whether information is new, or shared to express attitude, or to manage turn taking, who speaks when, who goes when, who's listening, who's got to be doing what right now. So there's so very many sub-functions to the structural function of using intonation. Now, this approach is especially practical for language teaching because it shows intonation as it really occurs in everyday interactions, right? It's all about real-time communication, not just some abstract rules. Now, about those, back to Janet Pierre-Humbert's model, it is way more abstract, and it's called the autosegmental metrical model of intonation. It is different, and her groundbreaking work gives us a kind of a formal, detailed framework that maps intonation as discrete tonal events. That does sound beautiful, I gotta say, a tonal event, like pitch accents and stressed syllables, along with phrase accents and boundary tones. I mean, it pursues the same effect, right? The structuring. We are going to choose Brazil's model over it because his discourse pragmatic perspective, it truly captures the dynamic, context-sensitive nature of everyday speech. It's just so very much hands-on, like I said earlier today. So for a long time, in the ESL world, a lot of people would argue that intonation is just too tricky to actually teach. There's certain things that you cannot teach, and that is true. There are very many things that can't really be processed on a theoretical level, and it's just so much harder to get it across to a person without them experiencing something on their own out in the field outside of the classroom. But that certainly does not apply to intonation. There's so much that can be taught. So research tells that very same story. It can be taught. It should be taught. It's doable. Studies show that pronunciation, and yes, that includes intonation, is both teachable and learnable, even for lower proficiency learners. And it's just, I cannot stress this enough, you gotta work pronunciation starting at the very beginning. You shouldn't wait for things to start kicking in where someone just all of a sudden realizes that, okay, that component of the mosaic of my learning process has been missing this whole time. So you really want it in there right off the bat, right from the start. What is it that research highlights? There's experimental evidence, first of all. Reviews of numerous studies have found that instruction on suprasegmentals, right? Supra, above, beyond, segmentals, the segments like sounds, the suprasegmentals like intonation, it leads to measurable improvements And whether through controlled reading tasks or spontaneous conversational exercises, learners show gains in tone, unit structure, overall clarity. It's been shown to really benefit the student, right? For instance, one study with Spanish learners demonstrated that a 10-week program on intonation dramatically boosted their speech production and comprehensibility. We really want things to be intelligible and processable on the listener's end. So on that super segmental intonational level, their English no longer sounded like Spanish, right? Let me tell you a quick story here, a bit of an anecdote. So Rowan and I, my husband and I, were traveling to Puerto Rico. I believe that was 2 years ago or so. And we're always so lucky to get the seats that are in the aisle that is basically right next to the exits, right? The emergency exits. And there's a rule, pretty universal. We keep on getting the same seats. So we're very familiar with the procedure where the flight attendant is supposed to ask you, are you willing to help us out, help assist the flight attendants in the very unlikely case of an emergency? And you're supposed to verbally actually say the word yes. And at a certain point, a flight attendant, before we even boarded the plane, asks us the question, are you going to be willing to blah, 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 in case blah, 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 blah. And Roman just went on to say yes, because he knew contextually, right? Situationally, we had already experienced that before. And I just stood there. I also knew what Roman had reacted to. I did process it real quick once the conversation had taken place. But I do recall myself thinking, was that in English? But if it hadn't been for our being experienced plane riders next to the emergency exits, I don't know if anyone who's not a Spanish speaker would have been able to make a lot of sense of what was being said, because he was exhibiting intonational patterns that are 100% Spanish speaking. So even though he was saying the words in English, and I assume some of the segments, some of the sounds were also anglicized, the intonationing, the rhythm was so Spanish that it sounded to me like he was talking to me in Spanish. If you are so very much adhering to your original L1, language 1 intonational patterns, it's so much extra work for the listener, and it just results in disconnect rather than connection, and we're always going to want connection over anything. Another thing is teacher cognition. Teachers, especially those new to pronunciation pedagogy, they build real confidence with proper training, right? So pre-service teachers, those who've just started their journeys, they have said that learning to teach intonation feels like finally fitting together all those bits and pieces of a puzzle that they never quite knew existed, right? So they open up a whole new realm of possibilities in the classroom, because this huge portion of the language learning process is no longer being ignored. And I have seen it happen in London, in New York, in the actual English-speaking countries. Intonation and all of pronunciation is not being paid enough attention to. And when it does get paid attention to, it just changes things dramatically. Now, raising student awareness. It's vital that students grasp what intonation does for them, right? So if you don't know what it does for you, you're probably not going to invest yourself, a whole lot. So activities that involve tracing pitch contours, discussing the effects of different tonal choices, or just, mirroring a model speaker, all of that is very, very effective. It cannot hurt. So students come to see that intonation isn't just about getting it right, doing it like, the model does it, but it's about conveying the full nuance of a message, and that message is their message, the learner's message, the speaker's message in any given conversation. It's not about the pristine modeling. It's about being able to navigate the choices that are open to you. And you got to be able to tell the difference, and you got to, be able to reproduce, replicate the same intonational patterns that you've made sense of to actually connect with the listener. Okay, now this is really important, okay? Foreshadowing. You cannot miss this, okay? So whenever we look at the big picture, intonation is both systematic and wonderfully flexible, right? It works within a broader discourse context, interacting with other elements like syntax, vocabulary, and body language, like we've mentioned today. And yet, here's the kicker. although intonation is probabilistic, meaning we can predict common patterns, but not every twist and turn, this very variability is what makes our speech rich and expressive and so interesting to look at. So yes, some things cannot be taught, but so many can be. And this is a good enough reason to not ignore intonation in the learning process and the teaching process. Do hope a lot of teachers are listening today. Now, our current models remind us that the intonation system is a toolkit for organizing speech in real time. So organizing, structuring, making sense of it so that the person listening can also make sense of it with just as much ease. Now, it helps speakers and listeners negotiate meaning. So manage turn taking, who goes when, how do we actually have the conversation ping-pongingly travel from one person to the next, signal social relationships, all of that, negotiating what's what is done through intonationing. And yes, once again, it can be taught, right? So role playing, reading out loud, all of that, plenty of creative activities for students, all of that is going to help master those prosodic features. It's not to be missed out on. So even as we extend these ideas to new and emergent varieties of English, the fundamental takeaway is clear. Effective intonation instruction can boost not just pronunciation, but overall communication. Whether it's, within high stakes academic settings, everyday interactions, it's just it's kind of more important than the actual sounds. So that's something I wanted to talk to you about in the next segment. Research over the past 15 years, it has increasingly supported the importance of intonation. For instance, one study by Hahn found that listeners use prosodic cues to confirm if an item is new or one that they're already aware of, right? That's kind of like, okay, articles are important, versus the. Well, intonational stuff is also going to work the same magic, right? So to track important information, to predict when one topic is ending and another is beginning, all of that stuff is only done through, well thought out, well practiced, well introduced intonational work. And it's been empirically proven. I myself was a student in an MA program back in London at UCL, University College London, and I had so very many professors from all over the world. There were people from France, Israel, Spain, Greece, Hungary, and yes, the intelligibility and of course the rhythmical intonational element, my God, it made a huge difference in terms of them, the professors, being followed and being followed successfully by all those people in the auditorium. In Hahn's investigation, English-speaking undergraduates listened to a Korean accented mini lecture, but it was presented in 3 versions. One with correct primary sentence stress, where it goes ba-bum, bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. The keywords are being pushed out. The help words that serve as glue in the sentence were not being pushed out vocally as much. Second version was where the stress was misplaced, and then the stress was omitted altogether in the third version, where it just got flattened completely, or it was being produced, I suspect, in a very Korean manner. So it was English words, but Korean intonationing. It sounded more like Korean than English at the end of the day. So the results were striking in the sense that students who heard the lecture with the correct stress patterns not only understood the material much better, right? And it's about being able to communicate effectively, but also evaluated both the speech and the speaker more favorably. So the actual person presenting was liked better because they were understood more easily. So night and day, right? Those are very different experiences on the part of the listener. Huge difference for everyone involved. In another part of the study, one group of students was taught segmentals, that is individual consonants and vowel sounds, while another group was taught the prosodic features, the suprasegmental stuff. The findings were clear. If the goal is to improve intelligibility, there needs to be a stronger emphasis in prosody, a stronger emphasis on intonation than the rest of it. So no one's advocating eliminating segment-based instruction altogether. Of course not. Of course we want those vowels. Of course we want the consonant-related nuance. But if the goal is to help students become more understandable, and that's what it should be first and foremost, then yes, it should include a stronger emphasis on prosody, that is intonation and rhythm, because it's been shown time and time again that errors in suprasegmentals can severely affect communication. That is, when it's compounded by grammar errors, for instance, things just get really, really confusing to the person on the listening end of it. There are real-world consequences, social consequences. Gumperz and Coltman, in their study conducted back in 1982, described communication breakdowns in a London cafeteria where speakers of Indian English and local British English misinterpreted each other's intonational patterns. So native speakers of English use a drop in pitch to signal this is the end of what I have to say, whereas speakers of some Indian languages, and there's very many, they might use a similar drop to indicate that they're about to make their main point. So such differences can lead to major misunderstandings and even negative judgments, as certain ESL speakers might be thinking to themselves, why are those people always interrupting me just when I'm about to say the thing that's the most important thing? So a very different function, a very different way of structuring your phonetic delivery in terms of why things are being said the way they're being said. Seemingly slim differences can lead to misunderstandings and negative judgments and so much confusion, right? Which we do want to reduce. Those little breakdowns, those not so little breakdowns, there's a cumulative effect to all of this. Now, fun fact, the reason these issues arise is that the prosodic signals, the musical cues, right, of rhythm and melody, they're typically acquired as part of our first language by the time we turn 1. So after that, the brain shifts its focus to vocabulary, grammar, and we tend to assume that these musical signals are universal, which is just not true. The truth is, each language has its own unique prosodic system. Without mastering the prosodic features of English, no amount of drilling individual sounds like a final s or z for plurality, none of that will fully improve intelligibility. That wraps up our deep dive into intonation and its vital role in both communicating and teaching. Thank you all for tuning in to Beyond the Accent. This was Carrie. Until next time, keep speaking with intention and stay listener friendly. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Have a great week ahead of you, and we'll talk soon.